Ready for a real deep dive into how our minds work? I'm excited to unpack these excerpts you've given us from Thinking Fast and Slow.
It's a fascinating look at how we make decisions.
He really is. And Kahneman doesn't just point out the flaws in our thinking, he reveals the patterns behind them.
Yeah, he gives us this kind of insider's view of how our brains operate, even when we think we're being totally logical.
Right, and he does that by introducing this idea of two systems, right? System 1 and System 2.
Yeah, like two characters in your head.
Exactly, I love that. So tell me more about these two systems.
Well, system 1, that's your fast intuitive system. It works on autopilot, think reflexes, gut feelings.
Okay, so kind of like when you swerve your car to avoid something without even thinking.
Exactly. It's all about speed and instinct, those mental shortcuts we've built up over time. But then there's system 2.
Which is
That's your more deliberate, analytical system. It's slower, more effortful, like when you're solving a tricky problem or, trying to resist that extra slice of cake.
So it sounds like System 1 is often in the driver's seat, and System 2 is like, hold on a second.
You got it. And that's where things get really interesting because these two systems, they don't always play nicely together.
And that's where the trouble starts.
Sometimes. Like, remember that invisible gorilla experiment Kahneman talks about?
Oh, yeah, that was wild.
Total classic. It shows how our focused attention, which is system 2 hard at work, can actually make us blind to the obvious.
It's true. When we're so focused on counting those basketball passes, we miss the gorilla walking right through the middle of it all.
And it just goes to show that even when we think we're paying attention, our brains are filtering out information they think is irrelevant.
And that's System 1 making those judgment calls about what's important.
Exactly. And it happens all the time. Like, think about how quickly we form impressions of people.
Oh, first impressions. We put a lot of stock in those.
Right, but Kahneman says we're actually making these snap judgments about someone's competence or trustworthiness just based on their facial features.
You're kidding. So I'm judging a book by its cover without even realizing it.
It's System 1 in action. It's looking for patterns, making quick assessments, and sometimes those assessments are dead wrong.
So we're walking around with these supercomputers in our heads, but they're making these snap judgments. It's no wonder we fall prey to biases.
And those biases, they're not just random. They're predictable outcomes of how our brains try to simplify things.
Right. He calls them heuristics, these mental shortcuts our brains use. And he dives into some really common ones, the availability heuristic. Man, I think about that one all the time now.
How so?
Like, I'll read a news story about some freak accident, and suddenly I'm convinced it's going to happen to me. Like, it just sticks in my mind.
Yeah, that's the availability heuristic.
Yeah.
If something's easy to recall, easy to imagine, our brains tend to think it's more likely to happen.
And it's like our brains are saying, hey, if you can picture it, you better watch out for it.
That's a good way to put it. And then there's the representativeness heuristic, which that's all about how we categorize things.
Oh, right. Like that example in the book with Steve.
Yeah, Steve. The quiet guy who everyone assumes is a librarian.
Just because he fits the stereotype. But statistically, it's way more likely he's a farmer or something.
Exactly. But our brains love a good stereotype. Makes it easier to categorize things, even if those categories lead us astray.
So it's like we're trading accuracy for speed, basically.
In a way, yeah. It's efficient, but it can definitely lead to some flawed thinking.
It makes you wonder how often we're misjudging situations because we're relying on those mental shortcuts.
Right. And speaking of shortcuts that can backfire,
Yeah.
we got to talk about the anchoring effect.
Oh, the anchoring effect. You know what always gets me? Those suggested donation amounts you see online.
What about them?
Like, they always seem so high.
They often are.
Yeah.
That's anchoring at work. Those big numbers, even if they're totally arbitrary, they become an anchor for what we think is reasonable.
It's like they set the bar, and I'm suddenly trying to figure out if I should give more or less than that amount.
Exactly. Even if you know logically you can donate whatever you want, that anchor is already influencing you.
It's so sneaky. It's like a mental tug of war.
And it's not just donations, right?
Yeah.
Salary negotiations, buying a house, that anchoring effect is everywhere.
It's like once that anchor is set, it's hard to break free from it. Which, speaking of things that are hard to break free from, loss aversion. Man.
Loss aversion. Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
That feeling that losing something hurts way more than gaining something of equal value.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
And that fear of loss, it drives so much of our behavior. It explains why people hold on to losing investments, why they stay in jobs they hate.
It's like our brains are saying, avoid pain at all costs.
That's a powerful instinct. Made sense in our evolutionary past. Back then, minimizing loss, that was key to survival.
Right, but now
it can hold us back, keep us from taking risks, pursuing opportunities. It's all about finding that balance.
Yeah.
Understanding how loss aversion might be influencing us. And speaking of influence, we can't forget framing.
Framing, right. It's like those optical illusions where the same image can look totally different depending on how it's presented.
Perfectly said. Framing is all about how the way information is presented, even if the facts are the same, can totally change how we react to it.
Right. It's like that example Kahneman gives about the medical procedure.
The survival rate versus the mortality rate.
Yes. Framing it as a 90% survival rate, that sounds way better than saying there's a 10% chance of dying, even though it's the same thing.
Exactly. Our brains, they latch onto that positive spin. We're naturally drawn to what sounds good, what feels reassuring, even if logically we know it's the same information.
It's like we're more easily swayed by the feeling than by the actual numbers.
That's a good way to put it. Our emotions play a big role in how we interpret information, how we make decisions. And speaking of being swayed, Kahneman talks about overconfidence too, right? Like how we tend to overestimate ourselves.
Oh, yeah. Like we think we've got it all figured out.
Exactly. We create these stories in our minds, these illusions of validity that make us feel way more certain than we should be.
It's like that saying, we don't know what we don't know, but we often act like we do.
All the time. We see patterns where there are none. We cling to our predictions, even when they're proven wrong. And then there's hindsight bias. That's a whole other beast.
Hindsight bias, right. It's like after something happens, we say, oh, yeah, I totally saw that coming.
When in reality, we had no idea. But hindsight bias, it can be more than just annoying. It can make us overly critical of past decisions, make us think we should have known better.
Makes it hard to learn from our mistakes if we can't admit we made them in the first place.
Exactly. And it can also make us less forgiving of others' mistakes. We judge too harshly because we think, well, I would have done that.
So it's like, with hindsight bias, we're rewriting history in our heads, making ourselves look smarter after the fact.
Pretty much. But here's the thing about all this. It's not about beating ourselves up for these quirks in our thinking.
It's more about understanding them.
Exactly. Once we know about these biases, about these mental shortcuts, we can start to watch out for them. We can slow down, engage our more deliberate system too.
Be a little more skeptical of our own intuition.
Exactly. And this brings us to what I find so fascinating, this idea of the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self.
Okay, two systems of thinking and now two selves. My brain's trying to keep up here.
I hear you, but it's not as complicated as it sounds. Think of it this way. Your experiencing self, that's you in the moment, feeling all the feels, the good and the bad, right? Then there's your remembering self. That's the part that reflects on those experiences, that tells the story of what happened.
So like the experiencing self is living life in real time, and the remembering self is crafting the highlight reel.
Exactly. And sometimes that highlight reel, it gets edited. Our memories, they're not always perfectly accurate.
How so?
Well, Kahneman says our remembering self tends to focus on the peaks and the endings of experiences, the most intense parts and how it all wrapped up.
So like an okay vacation with one amazing day would be remembered more fondly than a pretty good vacation with no real highs or lows.
Exactly. It's called the peak-end rule. We remember those peaks and endings more vividly, even if they don't represent the whole experience.
Wow, so even our memories are biased. No wonder it's so hard to make sense of things sometimes.
It's true, but by understanding how our minds work, how these biases shape our thinking, we can start to make more conscious choices.
So it's not about eliminating these biases altogether, it's about working with them.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing when our intuition might be leading us astray and knowing when to pause to engage that slower, more deliberate system too.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I've learned so much about how my own mind works.
Me too. And that's the beauty of Kahneman's work. It's insightful, it's thought-provoking, and it empowers us to become better thinkers.
To all our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive into thinking fast and slow has sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and maybe even inspired you to question your own thought processes a little more closely. Until next time, keep those minds engaged.